Hey, aloha, everybody. Welcome to Module 2, the cognitive neuroscience that's behind all of this effective teaching and learning. We talk about the 4 habits of powerful teaching and learning, and we're going to dive into the science behind it and also make some connections to the 4 habits rubric. So if we look at the cognitive science research, all connected to the 4 habits, all connected to what we're going to be learning in all 4 courses and especially the what to learn. But there's 4 things that the brain really likes. It loves to feel safe. Brain wants to feel safe. It wants to be interested. It wants to talk, and it loves to use pictures to learn. So we're going to be diving into this section on interest. So you've seen a copy of the 4 habits rubric. You know, we're looking at the green row going across. It's about purpose and expectations. And we're going to be largely be thinking about column 3 right now as we go through this process of learning about the neuroscience behind powerful teaching and learning. You remember that we start at the bottom, we work our way up. We're looking at the second one up from once we have the amygdala calm, now we can actually begin the learning process. And so there is a little bit of a sequence there. We're still thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, making sure that students are feeling comfortable with what the learning targets are and all of those kinds of things. And our main research terminology for this section is going to be selective attention. And I prompted this earlier in one of my presentations, introductions, I think, just that there's going to be a difference between procedural doing and cerebral learning. And so I hope that'll make sense to you when we get done with this. So here's our learning targets. You know, as teachers, I know that you know about learning targets. We know about the objective or learning intentions, whatever you want to call it. This module is largely about what is the neuroscience research, what does science say about learning and paying attention and how we help the kids learn and setting up that learning process. So there's 3 things I want you to be thinking about as you go through this module. 1, I want you to be thinking about the term learning targets. And I want you to really key into the word learning because it's going to play a real factor in all of this as we move forward. Because what we're not just talking about doing targets, but we're talking about learning targets, and that'll be really significant as we move forward. And all of these things are contained in the 4 habits rubric, and all of them are available to us to reflect on our own practices. So number 1. I want you to be thinking about learning targets. Second, I want you to be thinking about students processing the purpose with peers. So students processing the learning target or the purpose of the lesson with their peers. And then the third thing is after we've expressed the learning target and we've had the students process the learning target, I want you to be thinking about how often do you repeat the learning target. So these are our 3 things I want you to be thinking about: learning target, processing with peers, and repeat. All right. So selective attention. I've selected this picture here with the 1960s uh, switchboard for a reason to represent selective attention. But in this module, you're going to be learning more about selective attention. You'll be reading some research synthesis related to selective attention. Pretty fascinating stuff. Hopefully, you'll enjoy it along the way. You also would have experienced the idea behind selective attention in Module 1 when you were watching a couple of those videos as well. We're going to dive into selective attention. And remember, it's talking about cerebral learning and not just procedural doing. And so with the Burke Group, we've conducted about 55,000 classroom observations over the last decade. And we can just tell you from our experience, let alone the neuroscience research, there's a huge difference in a classroom when the teacher tells students what they're going to be doing today versus what they're going to be learning today. And it all has to do with the brain actually likes cerebral learning. The brain doesn't always like procedural doing. And so what we're trying to do is, in Ready to Learn, it was about getting the amygdala calm so we can now get ready to learn. And the first point of learning is getting students' attention so they can learn. We want to get their attention, and the best way to activate that is through the cerebral cortex, and have the learning have it be about cerebral learning and not just compliant doing. So, kind of blending things together here, uh, you know, in the Ready to Learn course, we talked about the brain stem, largely about the amygdala and how if that's not calmed down, good luck getting information up into the frontal lobe. Good luck getting information through the hippocampus and eventually stored and then able to retrieve. Because if the amygdala is not calmed down, we can't do it. So let's say now we have the amygdala calmed down. We have that out of our way. Now, the first moment of learning of this point of learning is actually to get students' attention. And now what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to do that and how to focus on cerebral learning. Because what we want to do is we want to move information towards the frontal lobe as much as possible to the prefrontal cortex so that we can actually take information and use it and learn from it, which we'll be looking at with Bloom's taxonomy learning habits. Learning habits. So, selective attention, cerebral learning. Here's our little catchphrase. The brain does not pay attention to boring things. Okay, this is obviously staged pictures here. This is not going to happen in real life, but it is true that the brain doesn't pay attention to boring things. And so, as we are moving forward in our classrooms, as we start to think about our own lessons, we have to keep this in mind. Now, as we dive into this, there's just 3 points I want to make related to the neuroscience research, and we also want to connect it into the 4 habits. So, with this idea of purpose and expectations of our lessons, the first thing we're going to do is just establish a few things, 3 things, related to the neuroscience research. We're then going to connect to the 4 habits rubric, and then we're going to connect to our own habits. So that's what we're going to do through this next couple of minutes. So back to our switchboard. Here is something that is kind of an inconvenient truth, but when it comes to attention, there's no multitasking. Even though we can multitask in our behavior, we can walk and talk at the same time. We can listen to music and work on some things. You can only pay attention to one thing at a time, and it's called selective attention. There's lots of research behind this. In this part of this module, you'll be doing you'll be reading some of that research. But the bottom line is this: the brain can pay attention to one thing at a time, and what it does is it plugs in to one of those little phone jacks there. And let's say that at the beginning of a lesson, you have the student's attention, you gain their attention, they are plugged into you. But the brain is always on alert to be listening and paying attention to other things around it. And so if something else gets the brain's attention, the brain will actually alert attention. It will unplug from what we were doing in the classroom, go over to another jack and plug in. It's probably one of their friends text messaging them. They'll do what they need to do there, and then they will unplug and then come back to us. And during the time that they were unplugged, they will have not been paying attention, and they will not be learning or gaining or storing that information. They just missed it. And this idea of selective attention is really the basis of why we're not supposed to drive with our cell phones anymore. We found out that when you're a distracted driver, you can only pay attention to one thing at a time, and if you accidentally lock on, you can glance back and forth. We can multitask and drive and talk and listen to the radio, but as soon as you pay attention to your phone, we could actually be driving down the road, and not even notice it until we alert back to the road. And so anyway, this idea, we want to take advantage of this idea of selective attention and being aware that the brain can only pay attention to one thing at a time. Now, there's a couple of other things that I think are pretty interesting here. Now, with this idea of selective attention, we want to just highlight this idea that the brain is always ready to pay attention. So when the kids come into our class and we're trying to like talk about the learning target, the brain is always ready to pay attention to anything. Even when we're asleep at night, our brain is ready to pay attention. If we hear a loud noise, all of a sudden we will pay attention. So the brain's always ready to pay attention. Now that's good news for the classroom because when the kids come in, they're ready to pay attention. The big question is whether we can get them to pay attention. Now, the next thing is, once we start talking, we start our class. The brain, we need to remember this, the brain is actually designed to forget unimportant things. So if the brain, after about 90 seconds, if the brain doesn't determine that this is actually important to me, it actually starts to tune it out. This happens all the time with background noise or temperature or just anything like that. And you'll see a few more examples throughout the modules as we do this. But the brain is designed to not hang on to everything. If it did, we would actually go crazy. We have to forget. And so the brain actually forgets most of what goes into it because it's just determined after about 90 seconds. It's really not that important. So given the fact that the brain's always ready to pay attention, it's not going to pay attention if it doesn't think it's important, and we can only pay attention to one thing at a time. That brings us to the rubric and how it's developed and how it's put together, and these two kind of critical points of science. One is we can actually use relevance to create attention, and we've known that for a long time in our lessons. We try to make the lesson relevant to the students and that kind of thing. So we can actually do that, or we might maybe we try to create relevance and so that they'll pay attention, but we could also get them to pay attention to something and maybe they create their own relevance. So the first part of that, and the first bullet in the 4 habits rubric here under what to learn, is the learning target. How can we use relevance to create or gain attention? The brain's ready to pay attention. We've got a little bit of time at the beginning of a lesson to try to get their attention, try to create relevance for the students or gain their attention in some way. And so one of the things we can do, and keeping in mind the brain can only pay attention to one thing at a time, that's why we're saying make sure we're paying attention to what we want to learn today, which the brain likes to do more than just what we're doing today. So can we get their attention by saying things like, the reason this is important is, or we've been studying this is how it's connected to prior learning. You're going to see several things in the rubric connected to the teacher using relevance to create or gain attention right off the bat. Now, keeping in mind, it's a learning target and not just a doing target. If you think about procedural doing, when you read through the rubric and you look at column 1 and 2, that is procedural doing. It's a teacher telling the students what we're going to do today, maybe even calling on a couple of kids, and then the kids are working compliantly. But the brain doesn't love compliance. Think back to your life, like all the things that you have to do because of compliance. It's such a bummer, and we do them because we're good people. We try to follow along with all the rules and all that. But the brain does not love compliance. The brain doesn't love doing things because somebody else had a great idea. The brain likes to learn things way more than it likes to do things. So the brain's ready to pay attention. Our first attempt is to use relevance to create attention. Now, after that, the next step is to use attention to gain or create relevance. Let's say that I just got done saying why I think that this is important for all of us to learn. It's connected to prior learning and all that. But now the next step that you're going to see in the 4 habits rubric is, now that I just got done telling you what the learning target was, now let's just go ahead and take a break. I want you to turn and talk to your partners. I want you to turn and talk to your group. If you're online, you might need to use a breakout room. I want you to take about 4 minutes and I want you to talk with each other. What did I just say the learning target was? Why do you think it's important that we learn this today? How does this fit in with prior learning for us? What would success criteria look like for us today? Getting them to interact with each other. You're going to hear more about this later with elaborative rehearsal, but if we can get the students, all of them, if we can get them all to talk about the learning target, it'll start to record in their brain. So our first step in the first bullet is I'm going to tell you why I think it's relevant. The next one is I'm going to ask you to talk with your peers about why you think it's relevant. All right, the third thing. So you've got, the teacher's telling you why you think it's relevant. Now we've spent some time talking about why we think it's relevant. Now this is a kind of an inconvenient piece of the whole thing. In the end, even after we gain their attention and we hold their attention and they've now processed it, now we only have about 10 minutes to hold it. So according to the research, and you're going to be reading some more about this in this module, we have about 10 minutes to hold their attention before we need to do something novel, review it, revisit it, or reflect on it again. So throughout this class, this is really the nature of what we're going to be learning about. We're going to be learning about the creating the relevance, letting the kids develop their own relevance, and revisiting it throughout the lesson. And we're going to hit that in a lot of different ways. But it's just fascinating. Even once we have everybody's attention, it's hard to hold it more than 10 minutes. You'll see some other things throughout the modules related to this. All right, so that brings us then to our what to learn rubric. And if you look in the third column here, we're talking about cerebral learning, not just procedural doing. And I just want to read what that third column has. Now, remember, we're trying to establish the neuroscience research. You'll get more of that throughout the whole class, but and then how it's connected to the 4 habits rubric. In this case, just listen, this teacher tells the student what they're going to be learning or thinking about during the lesson and why it's important, or how it's connected to prior or future learning. If now one of the things we're going to ask you to consider in this class is when you start class, do you present a learning target or a doing target? Okay, so if the brain can only pay attention to one thing at a time, do we tell it what we want it to learn? We've done about 55,000 classroom observations. A majority of classrooms actually have doing targets rather than learning targets. So kids pay attention to what they're doing all week long, but then we test them on what they've learned. Now, if we pay attention to this research, we will find a new importance, not only in the title of something called a learning target, but also the practicality of use the word learn in your learning target. Today we're going to be learning. Today we're going to be thinking about. Secondly, students processing the purpose. Now, this doesn't just mean I call on 1 or 2 students. You're going to see that in the second column as we do our learning walks. You'll see these things as you really get into how to read through the rubric and all that. But students process the purpose with their peers. They discuss it, they explain it, they clarify in some way. They're looking at criteria. They're maybe setting some of their own goals. But we're trying to establish this by looking at this rubric. I try to create relevance for them. I now give them an opportunity to create relevance for themselves. And then finally, everybody in class knows what we're learning today. Everybody's processed it. We're all in great shape. We still have to figure out ways to revisit it about every 10 minutes throughout the lesson. That's going to be our challenge. We know how to talk about the learning target. We know how to have kids turn and talk. We know how to revisit. This class is about habits. To what extent do we have a habit of doing these things? All right. So I love looking at all the rubric, the whole rubric, all at the same time. But I think it's really cool that we have an opportunity to just zero in on these 3 bullets. Now, this whole class, you're going to just keep on unpacking this, these 3 bullets in this third column. You're going to find that there's a lot of information in here. So as we get ready to head on out and read some more about the research behind this, I just want you to have, this is a great resource. I like this, and I think that there's even a handout available of this at the end of this module. But when we're looking at what to learn, we're talking about purpose and expectation. The science behind it is selective attention. And we're trying to not only let the kids know what we're going to do today, but let them know what we're going to learn today. Because the brain doesn't like to pay attention to boring things. And a lot of times the brain doesn't like to comply. So there's 3 bullets. The first one, you're going to be, I'm hoping throughout this class, you're really going to start embracing and using this common language throughout your organization. Learning and thinking. Why is it important? Prior learning. Student learning communities where they actually they pay attention to create their own relevance. but they process the purpose. They connect or clarify or look at a criteria, set personal goals. Then they revisit. Hey, that's just an exit slip. In the long run, we revisit throughout the lesson and then at the end. I hope this is helpful for you. This is setting the stage with the neuroscience research as we get into this, that it's really about cerebral learning and not just about procedural doing. So we're going to send you out there. This module was about. I wanted you to be paying attention to learning targets. Now this is either you already use the word learn all the time really well. Kids can pay attention to one thing at a time. Either you already do that, or this is a habit you can really start to work on. Either you call on one or two kids to say, "Are we clear about what we're working on today?" Or you have everybody talk about it. And then you either say it at the beginning of the lesson or you say throughout, or maybe use exit slips. So this whole class is really an opportunity to reflect on. We're going to watch other people's lessons and teach. We're going to learn about this rubric and really see it direct us in our own practices. Learning target, processing, and repeat. Hopefully you enjoy this module. Thanks for joining us here, and we'll see you online.